So I titled this talk Kitchen Wisdom, which turns out to probably be not a very good title for the talk, because some people thought it was like a cooking class, which it's not. It's a class on using our time in the kitchen to develop wisdom. And wisdom is seeing things as they actually are. And in Buddhist terms, that's the opposite of kind of where we usually are, which is we don't recognize the difference between the way things appear and the way they actually are. So what I want to talk about is how to use our time doing something most of us do, which is spending time preparing food in the kitchen, as part of our practice to be able to see things as they are rather than merely as they appear. Another way of talking about wisdom and seeing things as they actually are is to talk about their emptiness nature, which in Sanskrit is called shunyata. And I usually use the term emptiness. Sometimes I like to use the word devoidness because of what devoid implies. It implies that something is void or empty of something else. So traditionally anyway, in Tibetan teachings, they usually say that there are basically three reasons for being able to understand how things are empty in their true nature, or empty of what they don't actually have, or empty of the wrong appearances that we have about things or that we take about things. And they say that those three reasons are that everything exists in dependence on causes and conditions, even though everything appears completely independent. So the natural way in which I look at this teacup is it's just there. It's just sitting there right now, as if that's all there is to things. But you know, if we think about things, we know that that's an illusion. For one thing, it had to be made someplace. It's full of water and tea. That water came from someplace. The tea came from someplace. So what appears to be here is not merely what is here. This is sort of simplistic. The other thing is that everything appears to be whole. In addition to appearing to be autonomous, everything appears to be whole. But in fact, everything is made up of parts. I mean, I look at this cup, and as I said, what's important about it is the tea that's in it, which is the water and the herbs, and then the cup itself. But I don't see that. I just see that as one whole thing. This may seem a little trivial, but it gets much more interesting as we delve into this more deeply. The third thing about the way things erroneously appear to us is that they seem to have all their characteristics just right there, independent of our minds, which are actually attributing all these characteristics to things. I mean, I could say, you know, what's the difference between a teacup and a pipe or something like that? Maybe that's not a good example. But actually, as I think about it, it's not a good example. But the point is that pretty much everything we look at has certain characteristics in our experience of it. But those characteristics, to a certain extent, have nothing to do really with the object that we're looking at. I mean, yeah, okay, this is hard plastic. That is, in a certain sense, a characteristic of the object. In that sense, it's a little bit trivial. But a lot of the things that we relate to, and certainly the people that we relate to, we tend to have what the Tibetans say is an overestimation or an underestimation of the nature of those things, which is to say, we see them as being more attractive than they might actually be in their own nature, or we see them as being more repellent than they might be in their own nature. And so, an example of that is that at the end of the winter time, if the weather turns 60 degrees, I go outside in my shirt sleeves and it seems extremely warm. Or 50 degrees and it seems really warm after going through a period of 0-degree temperature. It seems warm. But at the end of the summer, if I have a 50-degree day, it feels really cool. It's the same 50 degrees, but what's changed? What's changed comes from my side, as they say. It's how I'm relating to the so-called objective reality. So those are the three sort of categories of reasons for why things are empty of or devoid of the characteristics that they generally appear to have. And from a Buddhist point of view, the reason that it's important to understand these three things is that the way we behave in relationship to these objects and what we expect of them is distorted because we don't actually know what they are. We see them in a very distorted way. That's technically called ignorance, or in Sanskrit, avidya. That's important for a number of reasons, and these days I'm paying a lot of attention to some literature and videos about the environmental crisis, about the climate crisis. And if you think about the way in which people relate to that, you mostly recognize a lot of behaviors that are pretty dysfunctional in relation to what we actually need to be doing in the here and now to deal with things. I mean, large segments of our country are in complete denial. They say it's fictitious, it's false, in spite of what we see with the evidence going on around us, especially this summer, which has been very clear that things are very unusual. So people, who deny climate science say, yeah, well, they're unusual. That's the nature of weather. Sometimes it's hotter and sometimes it's not so hot in the summer. And ignoring the fact that in Phoenix, there are cases of people who've fallen onto the ground, perhaps the sidewalk, who've received third-degree burns because it's so hot and they've had to be taken to the hospital. This is pretty unusual, Oh no, it's just weather, right? That's a kind of denial. But as other people would say, yeah, well, we're all, for the most part, not really in touch with what's happening. We're not in touch with our grief, as a really obvious example. I mean, my wife is very good at being in touch with this because, she reads the news or she sees what's happening. We look at a browning forest. We look at the fact that there are no honeybees in our backyard. I mean, we've planted in our backyard to sustain bees. We have all kinds of flowering plants. And most years they're covered with honeybees. You can hear a humming going on. Not this year, So there's a lot of grief, which we really don't want to be connected with. And as long as that's the case, we don't have a realistic view of the world we're living in, because then we're not motivated to act based upon what we see and feel. So those are just, some very rough examples. So the reason for my talking about practice in the kitchen is I found it to be a way to begin to more deeply understand our relationship with the natural cycle of things. I mean, we have an intellectual understanding because we're all intelligent people in this room. And we're all intelligent people on the Zoom link. I know that because I know some of you, and the rest that I don't know. I'm assuming that you are intelligent because you're here. You want to hear me speaking. So by definition, you must be smart, right? Okay, enough of that. But that's cerebral, that's mental. On the visceral level, we tend not to live in relationship with the climate reality. We tend not to live in relationship with the actual environment around us. We often tend not to live in relationship with other people. And we often tend not to live in relationship with ourselves and who we really are and what's actually going on. This is because of these delusions that we have. There are three reasons for these delusions. Because of our projections, our resistances, and so on and so forth, we're not seeing, we're not experiencing what's really going on. So the way I came to thinking about this, what I'm calling kitchen wisdom, and this way of practicing in the kitchen to develop a realistic understanding of things, is because I started out in my Buddhist practice in Zen, which is about sitting in a certain way. And then later I took on scholarship when I became interested in Tibetan Buddhism. And I focused a lot on Nagarjuna. And in fact, one of the texts that's being studied here at Thubten Norbuling, which is Atisha's Lamp on the Path, mentions two texts by Nagarjuna. And one of them is the 70 stanzas on emptiness, which I translated into English. Excuse me. So I was kind of a hardcore scholar of Buddhism at that point. And through some circumstances, my wife and I ended up living at San Francisco Zen Center's Green Gulch Farm for a year and a half. I went there as their visiting scholar, and I thought I was going to do some kind of academic research and this sort of thing. When I got there, they said, we're glad to have you. And by the way, what part of the temple do you want to work in? I said, what do you mean? I came here as your visiting scholar. They said, the Zen tradition is no work, no food. Where do you want to work? You can have the afternoons to be a scholar, but in the morning you have to work someplace. And I thought about it, and I chose the kitchen because I wasn't going to get rained on. If I worked in the shop, I figured I'd cut a finger off in the bandsaw because I'm kind of klutz. Although the kitchen turned out to be plenty dangerous also. So anyway, I ended up in the kitchen, which at first I thought was that was onerous. This is not why I came here. But within a week or two, I discovered that working in the kitchen was wonderful. I began to love it. We ended up spending about a year and a half there. And every morning I worked in the kitchen. And in the afternoon, I did various things. I ended up writing a book when I was there. But the best part of being there turned out to be working in the kitchen, which was a complete shock to me. And the reason for that was that I discovered fairly rapidly that in that particular environment, which required a certain level of mindfulness and attentiveness to what was going on, that what I had learned about the philosophy of emptiness, as articulated in Nagarjuna's texts, I could see in what I was doing on a moment-by-moment basis in the kitchen. So if I was preparing a meal, because they had an organic farm, I could see what was on the cutting board in front of me had the day before that been in the ground out in the field. So for an urban dude like myself, that was kind of neat to be able to have that happening and see the reality of what food was. I mean, for me, food was kind of like you went to the Safeway grocery store and, you know, it might come in cellophane or something like that. I mean, I abstractly knew that food like carrots came out of the ground, milk came from cows, I'd seen cows, and so on and so forth. But this situation was not abstract, it was very concrete. I would be working in the kitchen and the guys would come in from the fields with a box of carrots over their shoulders with dirt falling on the floor of the kitchen as they took it to the cooler. I mean, this was very concrete. And the other thing was, as I was working in the kitchen, I began to recognize very clearly that what I was doing was sustaining the life of the residents of the temple, because they were eating what we were cooking, and I could see that their life depended upon what was happening in the kitchen. And I was part of that. I was part of sustaining their life. And somehow it had never really occurred to me in my own life, of any cooking that I did for my wife and myself, or for myself, that in an obvious way, what I was doing in the kitchen was creating my own body. You know, I would cook something, I'd sit down and I'd eat it. And maybe I would watch television or listen to music or have a conversation with my wife. But for some reason, it was all from here up, even though I was eating food. I mean, how ridiculous is this? In that situation, I began to understand it down into my body because of the environment around me. And when we left Green Gulch, as my wife said, I started doing all the cooking, and she realized that what I was doing was I was nurturing our relationship in the food that I was preparing, that the shift had become that obvious in a certain way because my own awareness had changed and my own relationship to what I was doing had changed. So I became a big advocate of understanding how to take the abstraction of Buddhist philosophy into the concreteness of what I was doing in the kitchen of a Zen monastery. Well, of course, okay, this is a Tibetan center, so we, in a certain sense, don't tend to talk about concretizing certain things. But of course, in the Zen world, they talk about it all the time. So it's no wonder that I had that kind of experience of sinking into, or sinking philosophy, let me put it this way, into a tangible reality that was right there in front of me, and that I found transformative. So that my cooking shifted from whatever it had been before working in this kitchen, when I would cook for us, to something very different that my wife and I experienced as being very different in fundamental ways. There was a change, because there was a change in me and a change in my consciousness. That's what I wanted to talk about this evening. How do we do that? Because basically, unless we eat in restaurants all the time, or we're unfortunate enough to really only have hyper-prepared food that we toss in a microwave and push a button, we prepare food, right? So it's an ideal place to practice. Now, the Tibetans say that the king of reasonings in regards to dependent origination and emptiness, the king of reasonings in regard to understanding emptiness is the logic of dependent origination. And dependent origination is one of these three causes I was talking about, which is to say, everything that exists, everything that appears in front of us, everything we relate to, exists in this moment because of causes and conditions in the past. It may not appear that way, and that's the problem, but that truly is the way. When I take some carrots out of the refrigerator and I put them on the cutting board, they just seem like they're sitting there when I first put them on the cutting board. But if I take a moment to think about what's going on there before I pull out a knife and start cutting, I will realize that, yeah, the carrots did come from someplace. I mean, okay, they came from Sprouts Supermarket in many cases. Sometimes, if I get them at the farmer's market and I've talked to the farmer, I know they came from Espanola, which is north of Santa Fe, for those of you who are not around here. And I know what Espanola looks like. I've seen the farms up in Espanola. So that kind of concretizes things, and it relates me to the space in which I live in a different way. But I can also use my imagination. And when I look at that carrot, I can think about the fact it came to New Mexico from California, probably, or maybe Mexico, on a truck. Somebody was driving that truck. So the fact that this carrot is sitting on my cutting board actually depends upon a person who is driving a truck. Without that person driving a truck, there would be no carrot on my cutting board. And of course, it also depends upon someone who put it in the ground in a field, who planted it, who watered it, who harvested it. And as Thich Nhat Hanh says, it depends also about the sun and the water and the earth. Can I see the sun in the carrot? He had said, you know, you're reading a book. Can you see the rain in the paper of the book? Can you see the sun in paper of the book? We just see paper, typically. We don't see where it comes from. We don't see where it's made of. This gets at its parts, but we don't see how it depends on things. So what are the problems with that? Well, from an ecological point of view, the problem is that we live in disconnection with the world around us because we don't really understand how everything is here with us. And because we live in disconnection, among other things, we don't treat things with the respect they deserve. We don't appreciate everything that's involved in those things coming to us. We lack gratitude for them, right? So I learned to appreciate the carrot on the cutting board. And I use this example, and I used it when I was teaching at Green Gulch when I was there, because one of my jobs would be to cut several gallons of carrots for whatever stew or soup we were making for lunch that day. That's a lot of carrots, which you cut into rounds. And you really get into carrots when you're doing that. I mean, it's one thing for most of us to cut a carrot or two that we might be throwing in the soup. But if you've got a box of carrots that's this big and you're cutting them into rounds, you spend a lot of time cutting carrots, right? Okay, so I don't want to, as they say, beat a dead horse. But if you shift your nature of your relating to things to see the dependence of all the factors and conditions, causes and conditions that brought them to you, it transforms the experience. I could spend an hour cutting carrots and I was never bored. And perhaps more importantly than that, I never cut a finger off because I was cutting a lot of carrots with a really sharp knife and you have to do it fairly quickly. So you have to pay attention. You might be using your imagination, but you have to pay attention. Well, you can do that in your own kitchen and you can meditate in this way using your imagination and how these things come to you, and it transforms your relationship with them. I found this to be really important. Just as everything in the present depends upon the past, everything in the future depends upon the present. So for one thing, you know, when I'm preparing food, that food is going to be my body of the future. I mean, I'll talk about eating in a minute, but that carrot is going to be my body. I mean, a lot of times we just eat food and like, that's nice. I'm enjoying being in this restaurant and I'm enjoying eating this food, or I'm enjoying the soup that I've made. But do we actually look at it and see, this is my body? Because it is. Great, it will be your body, but nevertheless, it will be your body. If you ever feel like you're eating too much junk food or too much sugary food and you don't think it's good for you or something like that, there's nothing like looking at it and thinking, this will be my body. What do I want my body to be made of? Potato chips, chocolate candy. I mean, chocolate candy is great. Potato chips are great every once in a while. But is that all you're going to eat? I mean, what do you want your body to be made of? That changes your relationship to food also. Now you're looking at something in the present, which is having an impact in the future. One of the things that Kay and I took up during the pandemic was we started growing vegetables, which I had never done. Kay had always grown flowers. I had never grown anything. But we started growing vegetables for a variety of reasons. And we started composting also. So now that's also an interesting meditation, because when you're growing vegetables, you're spending time nurturing these plants, which are now going to become your body. So now you know this, if you're thinking about this. So these tomatoes that I'm growing, I'm getting great tomatoes this year. This kale that I'm growing, and I'm getting really great kale this year, I treat it in a certain way because that leaf in the ground is going to become my body, and it's going to become my wife's body. So it's not just a leaf anymore. And you can expand that using your imagination to the larger world. Now, because we compost, you know, the carrot tops and the skin that I scrape off the carrot goes into the compost. The compost maker breaks it down, and what happens to it? It's the soil for next year's vegetables. So this compost, which is kind of rotting away in the compost maker, is actually going to be my body and going to be my wife's body next year. Well, now, that's a different way to relate to it. Now, that's the whole cycle. So anybody that grew up on a farm understands this completely, implicitly, organically, viscerally. How many of us grew up on farms? Most of us are urban, right? We know it here, but do we know it deep down in our emotional selves? This is a way of cultivating this. And okay, you know, most of the food that we eat comes from a grocery store. There's only so much waste that goes into compost. When I sit on the toilet, there's waste. It does not go into the compost. It goes to compost, it goes to the plant that recycles these things. And there's a lot of controversy about what to do with that human waste. I know where it goes anyway, because I live near the plant, you know, that handles all the human waste from Santa Fe. But that's not the point. The point is, in the microcosm of our life, of our garden, and our life in the kitchen and our cooking, is a microcosm of the larger picture of what's going on in the environment. And if I can relate to what's happening in the microcosm and transform my understanding of the microcosm, then my experience has been that it transforms my understanding and experience and my organic, visceral relationship to the macrocosm. Because my mind is in relationship to the macrocosm, but my emotions aren't. And I found this to be transformative. So again, I come back to the fact that, okay, everybody maybe can't compost. Everybody maybe can't grow a little of their own food, but they can use their imagination to see how this works in the situation in which they find themselves. And I suppose if the way in which they cook is to throw a Pop-Tart into the microwave oven, they can imagine, I don't even know what's in a Pop-Tart, but they can imagine whatever that stuff is coming from someplace. They can imagine it becoming their body, and they can imagine it going to someplace. So now they've seated themselves in 3 moments of time in a new way. Many of Nagarjuna's writings about how to understand emptiness focus on the 3 moments of time and how they depend on each other. And he analyzes these things in great detail. And it's worth developing the intellectual understanding that's associated with this philosophy. But as the tradition says, that's only the beginning place. The next step is to meditate on what your understanding is, to reflect on it intellectually. It's called an analytic meditation. And then when you develop some analytic understanding about the emptiness of things, you pick a theme and you focus your mind on it. And that's how you deeply develop the organic, full cognizance of the true nature of phenomena, their empty nature. And their empty nature is not their non-existent nature. It's their transitory nature. It's their dependent nature. It's their nature apart from the way things appear to us, which is just the givenness of things. But the reality of them being in constant transformation, like our world. We want it to stay the same. Believe me, if there's anything we're learning these days about our world, it's not staying the same. And if we don't accept change, accommodate the change, and deal with change in positive ways, the outcomes are not going to be positive. The seeds of the future are planted in the present, and we can do something about the future as long as we're aware of the fact that that's the case, and that there's this ongoing transformative process, that things come from somewhere, they go somewhere, and if they pass through us, we have an impact on what the future is going to be. So that's very important. And you can, and I'm going to repeat this again, you can go from an intellectual to a visceral level in the kitchen. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, they say, as you develop this understanding and you go from an intellectual to a direct experiential level, you enter what's called the path of seeing, which is to say, you have a direct experience of the emptiness nature of things. You no longer look at things the way you and I look at things, but you look at things and you see what they truly are in their transitory, dependent, emptiness nature. Not that they don't exist. That's a common mistake in understanding emptiness, but in this transformative nature. Again, why is it so dependent? Because we're responsible for all this stuff and where it's going in the future. Whether we're responsible for going in a trash heap in terms of the stuff we have, or are we responsible to recycle it? Or are we responsible to gift it to people when we no longer need it rather than just tossing it away? Are we responsible for repairing it rather than tossing it? Because it's our thing to deal with now. It's our seed into the future. It's what we're willing the future. Because I don't know how many thousands of years it would take for this thing to decompose if I didn't recycle it. If I just tossed it in the trash, it would be around for how long? You know, some person in the future might dig it up and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is a great artifact. This is like something out of the Egyptian Empire, or God knows what they would, I mean, you know. But we don't want to will this kind of thing to them in the future. It's going to be a rusty piece of junk, right? So it makes us think about these kinds of things. All right, that's from the point of view of the three moments of time. But there's something else, which is the present moment. So back to the carrot on the cutting board. So in the present moment, there it is right in front of me. I talked about cutting huge masses of carrots at Gringo Zen Center. And the fact was that I had a very large, very sharp knife and a whole lot of carrots and 10 fingers. I had to watch the 5 that were holding the carrots, and it's going chicka 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 chicka. I had to be in the moment in what I was doing. The thing about being in the moment in kitchen is it does develop mindfulness. It does develop your ability to be attentive to things. But interestingly, and this might seem like the irony, if you're really in the moment after or while you're contemplating where things come from and where things go, that becomes very apparent. Just as I said, you could look at the carrot and see it's going to become your body. At least out of my own experience, you can look at the carrot and you can see your body. Now that might seem strange that you can look at a carrot and see your body, but I can attest to the fact that you can look at a carrot and you can see your body. Because in the moment of the present, the future and the past all collapse into this moment. This moment contains every moment of the past. This moment contains every moment of the future. And if you're really paying attention to what you're doing, you can experience that. And that is really profound. Because, again, in my experience, we all sit in our sense of our being in a flow of time, but we sit in it in a strange way. In particular, for myself anyway, I sit in it and I often find myself rewriting the past of my own life. And I've talked to other people my age who do the same thing. What a waste of time. Rewriting the past, it doesn't rewrite. Or I'm worried about the future. And there are things to be worried about if you want to worry about the future. But what is the point, really? Because if you're just worrying about the future, you're not creating a positive future. I mean, this is a weakness of mine that I do, as my wife well knows. I worry about the future. But there's sometimes I can extract myself from the oppressiveness of my own mind, rewriting the past or worrying about the future, if I'm in the absolute moment of what I'm doing. And if all I'm doing is writing something or reading the newspaper or sometimes taking a walk or whatnot, it's easy for my mind to wander off. But if I'm in the kitchen making something, like my body, then I can put my mind into the present and free it from itself in a very interesting way. So that's another thing that's very positive about kitchen practice. And if you're working in a kitchen and you're really getting into this, then there's some other stuff that you start noticing that kind of becomes transformative of the environment around you. Now, this may sound a little, I don't know, sacrilegious to say this, but for those of us who are tantric practitioners, we often work with a vajra, which is like a small scepter, which you hold in the right hand, and a bell, which you hold in the left hand, and they have symbolic qualities. They're sacred objects. But they're sacred objects because they're employed in a certain way in a ritual. Well, as far as I'm concerned, a knife, a cutting board, a stove, and good pots and pans are sacred objects. They're just as sacred as anything else because these are the tools that I use to create my body and create my wife's body. I mean, what could be more sacred than the tools that create our bodies? And they don't just create our bodies, they give us the energy for our minds, for our spirits, if you will. They empower us to meditate in certain ways. If we're not eating right, our minds are distracted in certain ways. If we're not eating good food, our minds are distracted in certain ways. And if we're not eating at all, it's really hard to meditate, not just because we're hungry, but we don't have the energy. So knives, cutting boards, electric ranges, pots and pans, these are all sacred tools. And if they're sacred tools, now we relate to the environment around us in the kitchen in a new way. My wife would probably say that I'm obsessive about keeping my pots and pans clean, that I scrub them. I have pots, I have pans that I have been cooking in for almost 30 years now. And you can see that I've been cooking in them for 30 years, but there's not one iota of food stuck on the inside of any of them. because I'm obsessive about keeping them clean. Because to me, they're the tools that I'm using, and they have a sacredness to them because of what they actually are. So yes, I'm obsessive about it. My obsession only goes so far. I'm not good about cleaning the floor of the kitchen as frequently as I should, or perhaps cleaning the sink as frequently as I should. But my knives are absolutely spotless and sharp and well taken care of. I have the same cutting board that I've been cutting vegetables on for 30 years. I keep it clean. My pots and pans are just like that, because that's my view of them. But that view of the sacredness of the environment can expand out. It can expand out into the home when it becomes visceral like this. It can expand out into the home. The gratitude that I have for good kitchenware is the gratitude I have for the home that I live in, and the gratitude that I have for the city that I live in, and the gratitude that I have for the place that I live, the country that I live in. I happen to love this country. I've traveled around the world, but I love this country. And I love the West. I'm not a big fan of the East Coast of the United States, but I really love the West. This is my place, and I feel gratitude to be here. That's organic. And feeling gratitude to be in a place is different than simply being in a place. And we can cultivate that. Again, this kind of practice, I think, can cultivate that. Now, I think if we only left it at that, it might be enough. It might be enough to understand our place in the environment and to try and change our place in the environment and to have a more wholesome place in the environment and to do our piece in creating a future for the generations that follow us. In and of itself, that would be enough, but there's more. Because I'm really talking about a meditative practice. And I've only been talking about a meditative practice in the sense of developing an understanding of dependent arising, or the way in which things are composed of parts and particles. If they weren't, if the carrot wasn't composed of parts and particles, I couldn't cut it up. It would be one solid thing, right? But I didn't get into that too much. Okay, so that would be enough, but there's more. Because understanding the nature of dependent origination and understanding emptiness, and these are two sides of the same thing, really two ways of talking about the same phenomenon, the same experience. What I've been talking about up to now has only been in relationship to objects, carrots, cutting boards, knives, kitchen, my attitude toward those things. But I haven't been talking about how you can take this meditative practice when you begin to develop it in this way inward. Because really understanding the mind, which is the subject, place of a point of awareness in relationship to these objects. Now that's even more transformative, right? If we experience our life in the world as unsatisfactory, is it because of the world or is it because of our minds? Now, in truth, it's probably a combination of the two. If you're really poor, there's a lot to be said for why the world is going to be the source of a certain kind of difficulty and suffering. If you're kind of like a basic middle-class person, or perhaps more affluent than that, you're basically comfortable. The world itself, for the most part, is not something that's the source of suffering for you. It can be, I mean, you could be in an accident and harm yourself. You could cut your finger with a knife when you're cutting carrots. Those are objective pains. They come from the objects in a certain sense. But as the Dalai Lama says, most of what makes us suffer, what makes us unhappy, is our minds. It comes from the mind side. Just as after the winter, 50 degrees feels warm, and after the summer, 50 degrees feels cool. How we relate to what's going on and whether we're attracted to it, repelled by it, whether we're neutral to it, whether we appreciate it, have gratitude for it, any of these things, which is what constitutes the experience that makes us happy, unhappy, satisfied, unsatisfied. That comes from our side, right? It was the same 50 degrees at the end of winter and at the end of summer. It was just absolutely the same 50 degrees. It was me that was different. And in particular, it was my mind, my attitude that was different, right? The study of the emptiness and the emptiness nature of the mind is the study of how the mind is distorted in the way it cognizes outer phenomena. It's also the study of how it's a study of how the mind is distorted in the way it cognizes inner phenomena and cognizes our nature and provides the attitudes that we have toward our nature. Now, typically, Buddhists talk about developing first an intellectual understanding of things, and then reflecting on them, and then meditating on them and seeing their true nature of things. When we try and do this with the mind, with our own consciousness, it's particularly difficult. It's particularly difficult because the mind is not a thing that we can somehow grasp. It's not like a carrot I can put on the cutting board. It's very elusive. And we think we know what it is. And in fact, we're sure we know what it is. But if we start examining it closely, the question is, do we actually know what it is? And do we actually know how it's functioning? So, for example, carrots come from someplace, I eat them, they go someplace. Carrot tops go into the compost, part of the carrot that I can't absorb goes to the poop plant, a mile away from me, 2 miles away from me. How does this way of thinking or perceiving apply to the mind? Well, for the first, and here I'm going to use the word mind and consciousness interchangeably. I need to be very clear about that. It's possible to look at these as being two different things, but here I'm going to use them interchangeably. When we look at our minds or we look at our consciousness, we see it as being the same all the time. That which is the subject in relationship to the objects of our experience seems to be the same all the time. But if we're really mindful about what's going on, even in the present moment, we have to recognize, if we're truly paying attention, that that's not true. And we can see that it's not true. Now, there's a difference between mind and thoughts. Obviously, thoughts come and go. We can see that thoughts come and go. So we know that thoughts are impermanent, that thoughts arise in dependence upon heaven knows what. Our habit patterns, what's going on in the world around us. If I've made the mistake of reading the newspaper in the morning, and I'm walking around feeling kind of grouchy for a while because of the news that I read, that mood of grouchiness and the thoughts that are associated with grouchiness have been triggered by what's in the newspaper. Those thoughts came from someplace. Yeah, they're in my mind, but they came from someplace. If I'd been sitting outside and looking at the sunrise, especially if there were clouds in the sky and it turned flaming red, or it's one of those beautiful indigo, maybe that's not the right color, those beautiful blue days that we get here in Santa Fe, I wouldn't be walking around being grouchy. I mean, that's pretty obvious to me, but I read the paper anyway. But the point is that mind and those thoughts depended upon those external things. But what about the mind itself? Because the thoughts exist in the mind. I'm conscious of the thoughts. That means consciousness and thoughts are two different things. So what about this consciousness? What about this mind? Is it really one thing? Is it really the same? or does it change moment by moment? When we look at it, we don't really see it changing moment by moment. I mean, if we've studied Nagarjuna, we've studied emptiness, we know abstractly that the mind is something, not a tangible thing, but it's something, it's a phenomenon. Therefore, it must obey the law of dependent origination, because everything that exists does. But we can't see that. Why is it that we can't see that? Well, in the Abhidharma, they say the reason you can't see it is because the mind changes 52 times, I think it is, in a finger snap. They didn't have clocks. So they said in a finger snap, it changed 52 times. Maybe it was 51, something like that. That's how fast we can't see it. It's like a fluorescent light, which appears to us to be a continuous stream of light. But in fact, because it's on AC current, it's switching on and off 60 times a second. That's too fast for us to see, unless the ballast in the light is failing, and then we can see it flickering, and then we know that's going on. But most of the time we don't. Our minds are the same way, but we can't see that unless we're master meditators. But on the other hand, we can see that the mind is impermanent. We can see that consciousness is impermanent. In fact, what do we think consciousness is? So this is a little game that I kind of play with myself, which is, okay, I know I'm aware of the people in this room. I'm aware of my own body. So there's awareness and there's body. I think actually some people are not. They don't recognize this distinction. But especially in the Western world, because we divide everything into subject and object, it comes to us pretty easily. Maybe more primitive people didn't. Okay, what does this have to do with the impermanent nature of the mind? Well, tonight I'm going to lie down and blessedly I'm going to go to sleep. And when that happens, I'm not going to be aware of anything until I dream. Now, technically, the Buddhists say that when I'm asleep and not dreaming, my sense organs aren't working, my mind isn't working, but my consciousness is still there. So I'm conscious of nothing. They don't believe in an unconscious. They believe there's a consciousness of nothing, because no sense experience, no mental experience, that covers the territory. So you're aware of nothing. But in my naive state of understanding, I'm unconscious. And I wake up in the morning, and this happens all the time. I fall asleep taking a nap. My wife will say, "You were asleep." I'll say, "I don't think I fell asleep." "You were asleep." How does she know? I was asleep, okay. But I didn't know it. What does this mean? It means that I'm conscious sometimes and I'm not aware of being conscious other times. In our Western language, I'm unconscious other times. That means that this mind, which is the mind of sense experience and mental experience, disappears. I ignore the fact that this mind disappears during every 24-hour cycle. It's gone, which means it's impermanent. It's here. I go to bed, I fall asleep, it's gone. I have a dream, the mind comes back, but the sense experience is not there. So I have a very different kind of experience. Then I wake up, and here's the world again. We don't really think about the significance of this. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, the only reason we know that we have consciousness is because we're unconscious. It's like, oh, I know that I didn't experience something. It was dark when I went to bed, and suddenly I wake up, if I'm lucky, and it's light. Instead of waking up 3 times when it's dark because I have to go to the bathroom, I wake up and it's light. Oh, gee, I wasn't aware of what happened. What does that mean? It means my mind wasn't there. Well, that proves that the mind is impermanent. We don't have to look at one 51st or 1/52nd of a finger snap to know that the mind is impermanent. Okay, so I'm belaboring my point. But my point is that we don't actually know the nature of our own consciousness because we haven't paid that close attention to what's going on. But if you get an organic view of these things, like the organic view of things that you get from practicing in the kitchen, if you can translate that organic understanding of dependent origination to the internal observation, then things begin to shift. And you start noticing things like, hey, yeah, of course the mind's impermanent because it disappeared when I was sound asleep. That proves it's impermanent, doesn't it? Ever think about that? I didn't think about that for a good 60 years, that proved that. I mean, I suffered from some serious insomnia. That helped me think about some of these things. But, so there it is. So what else do we not know about the mind? So that opens up all kinds of possibilities when we start paying closer attention to what's happening internally. And when we start paying more closer attention to what's happening internally, then things really begin to change. I ran into a statement in a book someplace by the Dalai Lama many, many years ago. And I've never been able to find this quotation again, unfortunately. But what he said was, when you begin to apply this understanding of the emptiness nature of phenomena to the mind, that's when profound and fast transformation really begins to occur. So, you know, I mean, it's one thing to sit zazen, for example, which we've done, sit zazen, and you pay attention to the breath, and the mind settles, and then what? What happens? What are you paying attention to? What are you noticing? That settling allows you to start noticing things, but if you bring a different attitude toward what you're noticing, then things change on a really profound and deep level. Okay, so I called this talk, perhaps unfortunately, Kitchen Wisdom, because a lot of people thought it was going to be a class on cooking, and we didn't take the time to read the description of the class. It's only tangentially. I'm not doing a cooking demonstration. I mean, it is about cooking, but it sort of is more than about cooking. Okay. I'm not going to go into the way in which mind changes when we apply this organic understanding of dependent arising to the mind. I'm just going to say one more thing and then I'll leave it at that. I mean, I've done other talks here at the Norberling about that, and we're getting past the 8 o'clock hour. I said there were three reasons, or three classes of reasons for why phenomena are empty. One was dependent arising. The other is everything that's made of parts and particles. Third is everything exists on the basis of imputation. This is exemplified in the Prasangika Madhyamaka school of thought. I'm not going to go into big, fancy philosophical language here. But the idea is, and I mentioned this earlier, a lot of the reason we don't understand what reality is because we are, to use the technical term, imputing our ideas onto reality. We're seeing things as being permanent because that's what we like, rather than things changing. I mean, for crying out loud, we see our bodies as being permanent. There's nobody in this room who's under 30. It should be obvious to us and everybody here in Zoom that our bodies are impermanent. I have a photograph of myself on my bookcase when I was 6 years old. And I look at it, that's David. This is David. What's happened here? Something's been changing, clearly. Mind has been changing, of course, too, but I don't see that so obviously. I see the body having changed. if you apply this notion or this understanding that you impute reality of a certain type onto phenomenon, and you see them for what you believe them to be, and you see them for what you think them to be, just as we see the carrot as being permanent when it's impermanent. If we see that process going on in relationship to our own mind and consciousness, it just blows everything wide open. Because the first thing that you have to realize is that you don't know what your mind is. You've spent your lifetime being totally sure. I know what my mind is. Here it is. I know what my consciousness is. Here it is. Guess what? That's a lot of thoughts that I have about my mind and consciousness. Some of them came from society. Some of them came from my having trained as a psychologist or became a Buddhologist. Some of them came from God knows where, from what my parents told me was the nature of my mind, or what some TV showed me was the nature of my mind. And I have all these ideas about my mind. But those are ideas about my mind. They're projections, they're imputations onto this fundamental something that's the key to my freedom, that's the key to living a satisfying and happy life. And I think I know what it is. So the first thing that I discovered was, guess what? Probably most of what I think is true about my mind is incorrect. Or maybe it is correct. I don't know. Let's take a look, but let's not assume we know. And let's look closely at what's going on. Just as mind is a dependent origination, which I didn't see, I'm full of misunderstandings about it, my imputations. And it's made up of bits that I don't really understand, because that's the way everything is. Parts, particles, dependent origination exists through imputation. So that's the point. Getting into that is where real freedom is. Getting into that is where real satisfaction is. Because lack of freedom comes from the mind. Lack of satisfaction comes from the mind. Okay, so this kitchen, ironically, is an entree to not just body, the kitchen practice is an entree to mind, in my experience, anyway. So I wanted to share that with you. All right, I'll leave it at that. So, I mean, one thing is to dedicate our time, because we're all bodhisattvas in the making, to the benefit of all beings and the world. So I don't have a specific prayer for that, although there are such specific prayers, but I'll just say that the reason I get up and do this kind of talk is to benefit whoever happens to be here and whoever happens to be listening, and to engage in the attitude of we care for each other. I mean, technically it's called bodhicitta, but in the simplest terms, we care for each other, we're responsible for each other, and we do the best to help each other that we can. So I dedicate this energy to that. And thank you for being here.